Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the link between deforestation and net zero and how data will help finance meet its targets. My name is Hannah Franklin, Communications Lead at Global Canopy, and I'll be moderating today. I'm joined by Sarah Draper, Corporate Performance Programme Lead at Global Canopy, Fergus Campbell, Sustainable Finance Advisor at ZSL, and Laura Garcia-Velez, Quantitative Analyst at Lombard Odier. So I'm just going to let our panelists briefly introduce themselves. Sarah, should we start with you?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm Sarah, and I lead the Corporate Performance Programme at Global Canopy. That includes our work tracking companies and financial institutions on what they're doing to tackle deforestation. We also work creating guidance and data to support financial institutions to tackle deforestation in their portfolios. And I'll hand across to Fergus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fergus. I'm a Sustainable Finance Advisor at ZSL. The Zoological Society of London, so working with the finance sector to integrate biodiversity into their decision making. That's partially through our Spot tool, which I'll come on to later, and also through our training for financial institutions and our range of advisory work as well. I'll hand over to Laura.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Garcia-Velez. I work as a Senior Sustainability Analyst in Lombard Odier Investment Managers. I serve specifically the part of the firm that focus on sustainable investments. The name is Holistic, and basically I develop research that supports our sustainability offering through themes like nature, materials, energy, and externalities pricing carbon voluntary markets. And I also serve the wider firm to support them in the integration of tools in relation to nature and biodiversity. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So hopefully after the next 45 minutes, you'll all have a better understanding of how action on deforestation is essential for meeting net zero, as well as the tools and data available to you. And a couple of housekeeping points before we start. So this session, as you'll see, is being recorded. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have a few minutes at the end for questions. And the chat function is also open for discussion. But before we get started, we've got a quick anonymous poll for you that should be appearing on your screens in a moment. So we just want to get a sense of why you're here today. Perhaps you don't have an agenda, you're just interested in learning a bit more about deforestation. Maybe you work in the finance sector and you want to understand how you can take action on deforestation. Perhaps you work in the government and you want to understand how deforestation fits into the wider net zero agenda, or you work in an NGO and deforestation relates to your work, or maybe it's none of the above at all. Let's take a look. Great, so actually 44% of you work in the finance sector, followed by 39% of you working in an NGO, 7% don't have an agenda, 2% work in the government, and 9% other. So it's a nice spread. And then we've got a second poll just to get started into the content of the session. That should be coming onto your screens now. So what percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions does deforestation make up? We've got 5%, 11%, or 23%. It's looking a bit neck and neck at the moment, the results. So actually, yeah, most of you got it right. 60% of you said 11%, compared to 40% of you went with 23%. And that's right. So deforestation drives 11% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. If deforestation were a country, it would be the third highest emitter in the world. It decimates biodiversity and leads to droughts and flooding. Globally, we've destroyed 1/3 of forests, and the rate of destruction remains high. Deforestation affects the lives and livelihoods of the 1.6 billion people who rely on forests worldwide, and that's close to 1/5 of the world's population. So given this impact, we cannot achieve net zero targets without eliminating tropical deforestation. And at the COP27, the UN high-level expert group clearly stated that the world cannot reach net zero without ending deforestation by 2025. This is because rapid action is needed to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of maintaining global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, as well as the global goal for nature to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So that's what we need to be working towards. It's a bit of a tall order, but Sarah, could you give us a sense of where we've come from in the past decades and where we are now?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so 10 years ago, we had very limited awareness on deforestation among the private sector. We definitely heard feedback from investors that deforestation just wasn't relevant to what they were looking at. It wasn't going to be a material risk. But also even from companies downstream, so manufacturers and retailers far away from the impacts on the ground, were unaware often when they were buying forest risk commodities like palm oil or soy embedded in the products that they actually were sourcing and handling. But deforestation is hidden in so many household products, from cereal to cosmetics to candles. So that awareness has really grown over the last 10 years, and it's much more common for them to be aware of what's going into those products. Global Canopy launched its first assessment of the most influential companies and financial institutions driving tropical deforestation in 2014. So through Forest 500, we identify and rank the 500 most influential companies and financial institutions on what they're doing to tackle deforestation. In the first few years, we would engage with companies that wanted to understand what we were doing and what we expected of them, and we continue that engagement to this day. But financial institutions back then were much less engaged. Maximum, maybe one or two would get in touch, and they were usually more interested in the data we collected on companies than in the assessment that we were making of their own policies and practices. So it's really promising to see 44% of the attendees here today from the finance sector, because we definitely wouldn't have been able to get that much back then.
And Fergus, how about you? What are your reflections?
Yeah, so as a conservation charity that work on biodiversity, we've definitely witnessed a kind of sharp rise in the level of engagement from the finance sector over the past 10 years. And actually, even in the past kind of 2 or 3 years, I've noticed a lot more engagement with us on the topic. I think all investors are beginning to look at biodiversity and think about how they approach it. And for those that are starting to take action, deforestation is proving to be quite a tangible way for them to do so, as in some it is quite quantifiable and there is kind of data out there. We've particularly noticed the shift in attention through our Spot tool. So for those that are unaware of that tool, we started in 2014 as well with assessments of palm oil companies, and we've now expanded to cover timber and pulp and natural rubber companies as well. We rank these companies based on the transparency of their disclosures, and the FIs, financial institutions, are kind of one of our main user bases. So although, again, not a huge amount of uptake right at the beginning, we now see over 200 financial institutions using Spot data, and for a range of different purposes as well. So we have asset managers such as BNP Paribas Asset Management, Columbia Threadneedle and Robeco, who are using Spot as a way to inform their company engagements. And then we also have banks such as Credit Suisse, who are using Spot scores as kind of thresholds as part of their palm oil sector policy for new lending. So yeah, definitely quite a range of uses and engagement with us at the moment.
Great. So it sounds like the needle is hopefully moving in the right direction. Sarah, is that a fair assessment?
So yeah, there's definitely increased engagement, but despite that, last year, so in 2022, we found that the 150 financial institutions in the Forest 500 gave $6.1 trillion in loans or investments to just the 350 companies in the Forest 500. So they're most at risk of driving deforestation. $6.1 trillion is twice the size of the UK's GDP. So that's a huge amount of money and of leverage that is going into those companies that could be used to drive more sustainable practices. As regulatory pressures for companies to act on deforestation increase, we do expect to see more financial institutions waking up to the risks associated with this financing and exploring ways to shift their investments from nature negative to nature positive.
And can you give an overview of some of those regulatory pressures, Sarah?
Absolutely. So the EU due diligence regulations officially come into force this week. And companies will need to ensure that the products sold in the EU market are deforestation free. There's similar regulations in the UK, which will require companies to ensure that products sold in the UK are free from illegal deforestation. Regulating the finance sector is one of the most important things that the UK government could do right now to tackle deforestation. And there's currently a group of investors with £2.7 trillion in assets under management, which are supporting more action from the UK government on that.
So it does sound like we can expect to see a lot more progress in the coming years. Laura, I'd like to turn to you now for your perspective on this and Lombard Odier's journey.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say like one of the most core moments was the COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, where nature was put at the core of the climate agenda, which is definitely much more advanced. And after that COP, we saw last year in the COP15 in Montreal, the goals on nature updated, particularly to preserve and restore land. But more practically for the financial sector, there has been a big advancement on sustainable finance disclosure regulations. This is the SFDR and the EU taxonomy coming with building a scientific framework for us to basically classify companies as sustainable or not. And through this assessment, we basically look at 3 questions. Basically, what is the sustainability contribution of those companies to those 6 environmental objectives? That as companies are contributing to those objectives, we make sure that they are not harming other environmental objectives. And also we look at governance issues. Particularly in the do not harm question is where we are seeing an emergence of the use of nature-related risks and deforestation tools. So particularly here, we are moving a little bit away from ESG and business practices, and we are starting to look specifically at how credible are the targets that companies are setting to reach a deforestation-free, but also we're bringing a lot, the geospatial angle is not only about business practices, but where the companies are sourcing those forest risk commodities, where are those operations. But I think here is important to acknowledge that there is still a lack of data, at least in terms of sectors that are highly exposed to these risks. But even among the companies for which we have data, sometimes we don't have like a full overview of the supply chain. So we are expecting that with the due diligence and those requirements from the European Union to start coming into place, that we have actually more data that we can start engaging with companies and actually deciding on pathways on how to act on this.
Thanks, Laura. And I think we'll come on to the data point in a moment. Firstly, I'm getting the sense that there's action that has started to be taken, but it's not nearly at the scale that's needed. Sarah, could you come in on that?
Yeah, so Global Canopy data last year found that 98% of companies with significant climate commitments were going to miss those commitments because they were not taking sufficient action on deforestation. So then that, of course, means that it's going to be much harder for the financial institutions investing in those companies to meet their own climate commitments as well. So yeah, there's a lot more that needs to be done, and a huge amount, a lot of companies and financial institutions to take more action. Gaps in guidance and data have long been barriers to action, but there's no longer entirely hold. So there is now way more data than there was 10 years ago, notwithstanding Laura's comments on some gaps that still need to be filled. but there's also practical tools and guidance available that show the path that needs to be taken. So 2023 can and must be different.
And could you talk a bit more about those tools, Sarah? So what tools and guidance are currently available for finance?
Yeah, so I'll start by talking a bit about Forest IQ. So Forest IQ is a new database which brings together the most credible and accurate corporate data on deforestation into one place. This enables financial institutions to identify risks and opportunities across the commodity value chain to help them to deliver deforestation-free portfolios. Forest IQ is backed by a partnership of NGOs who have many decades of experience on deforestation, including ourselves, Global Canopy, also the Stockholm Environment Institute and ZSL Spot. And it was created with a working group of 10 financial institutions, including banks and asset managers, who supported us in the design of the database and making sure that it was fit for purpose.
Great, and perhaps people might have questions on Forest IQ that we can get to later. But Fergus, I wonder if you could give us some context as well about some of the wider tools that are available.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, I think we've got the Spot tool and obviously Global Canopy of Forest 500. There's trace supply chain data and also CDP Forest that are providing the self-disclosed information from companies related to deforestation. And there's also, so yeah, that's really where Forest IQ is going to be great, is kind of pulling those together and being kind of a good place to go for deforestation data, I think, because there are kind of metrics out there from ESG data providers on biodiversity that are a lot more broad, and I think sometimes lack the kind of granularity needed to tackle these issues, as they might be kind of aggregating scores from a lot of different kind of aspects of biodiversity. So I think focusing on deforestation as a topic for data is a really good way of approaching it. And yeah, there's also kind of NGOs and certification schemes that provide useful information, and there's satellite tools as well, such as Global Forest Watch, that do deforestation alerts, and you can track kind of tree cover loss over time as well, which is really useful.
And Laura, what tools have Lombard Odier been using so far? Could you just give us a bit more information?
Yes, absolutely. So look, since the 90s, we have had like an ESG team, small ESG team that used to send surveys to companies, including elements around biodiversity risks and management. But what we have right now is a group of more than 50 analysts with very specific backgrounds. In my case, is geospatial science. And we're focusing more and more on understanding how we can invest on nature aside of the typical asset classes. And to do this, we rely on many tools. So we rely on tools that are broadly about materiality, understanding companies by virtue of their activities, of their sectors, what are the issues that are most important in terms of environmental and social, but then specifically about biodiversity and deforestation. What we have so far are tools where we can look at company locations and assess which companies are located in areas of high biodiversity. This is one of the indicators we need to report under SFDR, as I was explaining previously. And recently we developed our forest management tool, which basically covers two dimensions. The first dimension is basically to answer how companies are exposed to deforestation, either because they supply commodities that are at risk or because they incur in land use, for instance, mining, utilities. But then the other dimension is very much about how they have been managing the issue historically through controversies. Are there any existing controversies? And then going forward through target setting. So to maintain this tool particularly is very relevant for us that we have like an integrated database where we can easily extract metrics. And here is where the effort that has been done through Forest IQ is quite substantial for us. I think it's not only about the data, but it's also very much about the framework, because, you know, we can ask a lot of questions to companies about deforestation, but what we actually need is to understand where they are operating, how those operations carry that risk depending on those geographies. But then when we come to the target, we even need to go further. It's not only about saying, okay, they are aiming to eliminate deforestation by 2025, but how those KPIs look. What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of certifications? What does it mean in terms of having full traceability of their supply chain, or even engaging with their suppliers? So I think here is where these tools kind of set as well frameworks that are very important for us on understanding how we need to engage with companies and continue developing those views that eventually will lead to a more refined investment decision making around these issues.
And I wonder if you could speak a bit more to that, Laura. So have you actually made changes to your business practices as yet, or how you're engaging with companies?
So far, we use deforestation data mostly through engagement rather than restrictions. As data is starting to become more and more available with the due diligence that Sarah was mentioning of the European Union coming into place, we are expecting those kind of conditions to start changing across our investment process. But at the moment, we do need to engage with companies. We need to ask them to provide us with information about their supply chains, see how much they understand about their sizes of their indirect suppliers, direct suppliers, what is actually what they cover in terms of certifications. And even sometimes, even companies might not have 100% use of certified commodities, and then you engage with them and you realize that actually there are not enough certified commodities. So I think this is true that through more data, we will be able to start refining our investment processes a little bit more towards restrictions. But I think as well is kind of the fundamental basis, the engagement to really understand what really realistically we can expect from those companies going forward.
Sarah, Fergus, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, any reflections?
Yeah, I guess just to add on the guidance side, there is now much more guidance for financial institutions to follow, to use the data that is available to tackle deforestation in their portfolios. We developed the finance sector roadmap for eliminating commodity-driven deforestation with many expert partners and with feedback from more than 60 financial institutions. And that is aligned with and endorsed by the Accountability Framework Initiative that creates guidance for companies in forest risk commodity supply chains to be tackling deforestation. And we also have detailed guidance on due diligence on deforestation, and guidance tailored to pension funds as well.
Great, and we'll include some links to those in our follow-up email as well. But for now, we're going to have another couple of quick polls just to check you're still here. I know there's been a lot of numbers that have been mentioned. So those polls should be appearing on your screen in a moment. So what percentage of companies are currently set to miss their net zero targets? Is it 68%, 78%, or 98%? That is quite split, and perhaps because the number is actually so high. So the correct answer is 98%, and 44% of you had gone with that, and 38% of you went with 78%, and 17% of you went with 68%. Sarah, do you want to remind people on that, that statistic?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was looking at companies with significant exposure to deforestation who also had significant climate commitments. And yeah, unfortunately, we found that 98% of companies in the Forest 500 with significant climate commitments were set to miss their climate targets because they're not acting on deforestation. And as we heard from Hannah earlier, we absolutely have to tackle deforestation to meet our net zero goals.
And then the second poll should be appearing on your screen in a moment. So in 2022, how much did the 150 financial institutions in the Forest 500 give in loans and investments to the 350 companies most at risk of driving deforestation? So was it 6.1 trillion, 3.1 trillion, or 6.5 billion? And again, you're fairly split on that, but the slight majority of you got that right at 52%. So the correct answer is 6.1 trillion. 25% of you went with 3.1 trillion and 23% of you went with 6.5 billion. So yeah, very high numbers, but hopefully we can shift those in the right direction in the next few years. I wanted to ask you all, what advice would you give financial institution that perhaps knows a little bit about deforestation but just doesn't quite know where to get started? Perhaps Fergus, I can turn to you first.
Yeah, sure. I think we've already given quite a lot of guidance today, and I think there's always places to start. I think, as Sarah mentioned, kind of global Canopy guidance is a good place to look, depending on what type of financial institution you are, and also just kind of start to map your portfolio slightly, start to try and uncover kind of which commodities are you exposed to, and often there will be a useful data set already existing on that commodity. So whether it's spot or Forest 500, or if it's a protein, it might be the kind of Fair Protein Producer Index or something like that. So yeah, trying to really look at your portfolio and get an understanding and start to engage with your companies, even if it's just to discover what kind of policies they have at a very high level on deforestation, and if they're exposed to it. I think it's a good place to start. I don't think we need kind of perfect data to really start the engagement process. I think there's always conversations that can be had with kind of just an initial level of understanding of the kind of gravity of the issue. So yeah, I think plenty of stuff to get going with.
Laura, how about you?
Yes, I would say start with the vision of the heat map. So basically, where are biodiversity risks and deforestation risks in your investments? At Lombardo there, we do that either through the sectors of the companies that we hold, or to the revenue activities that those companies are involved. There are already existing tools on that. For instance, the Encore tool is publicly available and could be used as a starting point. But I think in addition to that, sometimes, I mean, here in this panel, we're talking about deforestation driven by the use of forest risk commodities like palm oil, timber. But I think it's important as well, first of all, to understand what kind of expectations we have of those companies. So those companies are very much involved through that risk is through the supply chain. So it's very much about certifications, it's very much about the traceability of their suppliers. But then at the other side of the spectrum, we have companies that probably have lower land use impacts, but still they need to have some sort of biodiversity policies. And this is because they operate in areas that are of high biodiversity or close outside of urban centers. And mostly these are energy companies, water utility companies. And here is not anymore about the supply chain, it's actually about the practices that you have in place. Are you actually restoring? Are you actually committing to net biodiversity loss? So here I find really interesting the progress that has been done in the science-based framework. There are already some companies that are kind of testing this framework to set goals specifically on restoration, on water management. So I think it's important to kind of inform as well this engagement process that Fergus was talking about, based on which companies are material, but what are actually our expectations in terms of how they should manage these issues.
Thanks, Laura and Sarah.
Thanks. Definitely would agree with Fergus and Laura that the first step is really understanding your exposure and therefore where you will have leverage. So which companies in your portfolio are the most exposed, which commodities, which geographies, that kind of thing. And definitely to echo Fergus's comment, I don't think that has to be a fully detailed, complete risk assessment where you've got all possible data on each of those companies, but even a first high-level look to understand, at a high level, where are some of the most exposed companies, where might you be able to start engagement, and starting that process, learning as you go, and also learning from other financial institutions. So definitely looking at who the leaders are in the space. What are they doing? How have they started this out? Because there has been lots of progress. There are examples that can be followed, and guidance and data, as we've said. So definitely starting by mapping that out. Where's your leverage, but also what are the guidance, the examples, and the tools that you can use to help you.
Right, so we're now going to open up the floor to some of your questions, and please do keep these coming to the Q&A box. We've already had quite a few come through. First question is, Laura, probably this is one for you. What commitments are investors making on deforestation?
Yeah, so I referred before to the COP26 in Glasgow, and during this COP, a group of investors signed an open letter to end tropical deforestation. And basically this commitment entails to eliminate deforestation risks by 2025. But the reality, Sarah was referring previously to Forest 500 for financial institutions, is that still very few financial institutions have set targets. So of the 150 companies that were assessed last year, I think it was only 21 that have actual targets to tackle this. What we are expecting is that with this assignment of FSDA, like these commitments on financial institutions start to increase. But I have to, to acknowledge that at the moment it's still like an issue that is not, as big as it is, for instance, the setting of net zero targets or climate related targets.
And we've actually had someone also ask Laura, the tool you mentioned a few minutes ago, I think it was the on-call tool, wasn't it, that you were saying you were using?
Yeah.
Do you want to just give a bit more information about that tool?
Yes, absolutely. So look, NCOR basically gives you an overview of sectors and how those sectors impact different areas of biodiversity. So basically it would be how, the hydropower sector impacts terrestrial ecosystems, how it affects water quality, and so on. And it also gives you an overview as well of the dependencies, because it's not only about how we impact nature, but also how much we rely on things like water purification and water quality. So what we basically do internally is that we use these existing heat maps and we kind of develop our own heat map. We have a bit more of refined information, not at the sector level, but revenues of companies. This type of information is normally of commercial use. So we, discuss and get this data from Bloomberg, FactSet, and other data providers that offer this detailed information.
Right. And Sarah, this is probably one for you, but what are financial institutions currently doing with the data that they have on deforestation in order to act? So we talked to Laura a little bit about this already, but what else are you seeing, both anecdotally and perhaps more widely?
Yeah, so we've talked a bit about using it to guide engagement, and pushing your expectations for companies and setting those and pushing them in the right direction. But something we're also seeing more and more of in the last couple of years is financial institutions using data on company performance on deforestation to guide their voting and set voting policies, and actually setting requirements that they'll vote against the board or against management if they're not meeting their expectations on deforestation. So we're seeing some financial institutions just doing that privately, and some setting that out as a public voting policy in advance of the AGM season as well. So it definitely seems like something that's picking up traction as a way of kind of escalating that engagement as well.
Yeah, is that something you might consider for your next AGM season, Laura?
Yes, we have had some cases where we have informed our proxy voting based on data on targets and fulfilled specifically on KPIs. But it has been probably like 2 or 3 cases. I hope this kind of data can be leveraged in a more, consistent way when on the upcoming AGM seasons.
And we have a question on the UK government regulation. So what does it mean for the UK government to regulate financial institutions on deforestation? How would they do that? Would it be like the EU import ban or more disclosure? Sarah, would you be able to talk to that, or maybe Fergus?
Yeah, Fergus, do you want to come in first?
No, you go ahead.
Sure. So I think it's likely to be a bit like the EU due diligence regulations, so setting more due diligence requirements for financial institutions. So having to include deforestation as one of the risks that they conduct their due diligence across when they're looking at either new clients or investments or renewing old ones. So factoring in what data is available on how that company is exposed to deforestation risk, how that's likely to impact them, and pushing them to consider that in those decisions. Fergus, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
No, I think you covered it. I was going to say the very same. Yeah, we're kind of waiting on the UK Environment Act, Schedule 17, to potentially kind of follow suit and follow the EU deforestation regulations for importers. And hopefully at some point, those kind of due diligence requirements will be extended to financial institutions as well, which we're definitely encouraging.
And we have another question come in about regulations and frameworks. We've got, what's your view of the new ISSB framework regarding deforestation data, including CDP forest data?
It's not something I'm very clued up on yet, but yeah, if anyone else is, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just familiar with CDP data, but not necessarily the ISSB. I think what is really interesting about CDP particularly is that they probably have already the frameworks in place and the templates, which would be quite useful going forward to collect data on traceability or areas of origin of these commodities. So yeah, I mean, we use it fundamentally, but obviously we would like to migrate over the future to a Forest IQ that already has like processed some of this data, and we don't necessarily need to look at the detail of specific countries tackling that the companies are supplying commodities.
And to keep in line with traceability, so what traceability tools do you see as most promising? And I know we've actually mentioned a few of them during the session, but probably worth a bit of a recap about what's out there.
Sure, I can just jump in briefly. I mean, I think it's a really important question on the kind of traceability requirements involved in EU deforestation regulation. I think I can just speak briefly on the kind of natural rubber industry, but the natural rubber sector is made up of almost 85% smallholder farmers. So there was slight concerns that the inclusion of natural rubber in the EU regulation would have a disproportionate effect on a negative effect on smallholders, and make it hard for them to kind of produce goods that are traceable right down to that kind of smallholder farm level. But there's a lot of work going on in the rubber industry at the moment through the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, GPSNR, looking at kind of what traceability tools can be used, and actually some of the natural rubber producers and tire makers themselves are kind of developing their own traceability tools and mechanisms to to allow that to happen. But yeah, I think for some industries it's going to be harder than others. So I just know that for natural rubber it's going to be a big challenge, but it looks like the industry is really taking it seriously and is very active in that space. So yeah, hopefully that'll be something to look out for. But I don't know if the others have any other traceability tools they wanted to mention in other industries.
No, shall we go on to the next question? This is one for you, Laura. So what help do asset managers need from other financial actors like asset owners, index providers, just reading last bit, and ESG data providers?
Well, my answer is going to be probably like a bit expected, but I think like a certain degree of standardization. So coming back to the traceability data that we were discussing before. So these new due diligence requirements, we will have like suddenly lots of information about what are the mills, what are the processing facilities that specific companies are sourcing palm oil, are sourcing timber. And then each data provider is going to get this information and create its own IDs of these facilities. So there are already tools there that have already tagged these facilities. One of those tools is Trace. So, you know, as a user of this data, what I would like to see is just kind of a certain degree of interlink with the way how we connect that supply chain. Because at the end of the day, it's a space where there are going to be like some blind spots for some years. So it needs to be kind of a joint effort to standardize this a little bit more. But I think actually where data providers should be focusing now a bit more, obviously the supply chain is a very big challenge, but is it actually what metrics are we going to develop? What actually we can say about those supply chains. So in this panel, we are talking specifically about prevention. What are we companies doing in terms of not incurring into deforestation risks, but going further, we want to know as well what companies are doing to enhance biodiversity. Are they actually applying soil regeneration practices in their cultivation lands? Do they actually work with timber suppliers that have agroforestry? And I think here is where it becomes more interesting in terms of remote sensing, like what are the actual indicators that we're going to look at a plot level, and then the entire investment view changes. Is not anymore about preventing these risks entirely, but also about understanding which companies are driving some enhancement of nature.
I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to quickly come in on anything Laura's just said there.
Yeah, no, I think really interesting reflections. Thank you, Laura. We definitely also hear, yeah, definitely kind of calls for more data and more integrated data from ESG data providers, but also support from asset owners to kind of call for the same things, to use their leverage to encourage asset managers to act. I think it's, yeah, just reflecting that we do need all types of financial institutions and companies throughout the supply chain all pulling in the same direction. We need to hear that demand for products and for deforestation-free financing, and we need to hear that demand for deforestation-free products as well, and make sure that we're all heading in the same direction, asking for the same standards.
And just very briefly on this question about geospatial data, how are financial institutions using geospatial data? I know, Fergus, you mentioned Global Forest Watch is a good tool. Laura, are you using geospatial data at the moment?
Yes, so we specifically for deforestation, what we have done before in the past is basically we have the locations of companies. So this would be, for instance, mines, and then we draw like a 10 kilometers around them, and we look at databases like Global Forest Watch, which bring insights on forest loss, and we look at how much forest loss has occurred around these locations. But obviously here it starts like a lot of questions of what is exactly the accountability, because there are so many actors even within this radius. So we have done like some, exercises with the University of Oxford, trying to kind of really basically segregate. So what actually that forest loss corresponds to agriculture-driven deforestation, how much of it corresponds to actually an expansion of the mine. But definitely this is a space where research can evolve further, and it would be super useful, because it's not entirely about what you can see from a space, but how you link that information and you make companies accountable for that. And for that, you really need certain spatial algorithms in place. But what we do right now, and we have actually included that already in our investment process, is not necessarily deforestation, but we look more like an ex post assessment. So we have a database of 1,500,000 locations, and we look at where are those mines, where are those power plants in relation to protected areas, in relation to intact forest landscapes, which are areas that have like this kind of very primary forests. And that might not be necessarily, like an indication of this company is responsible for X amount of land use, but at least it indicates us how companies basically decide on where to put those operations, and that might already carry some inherent risks to deforestation and biodiversity loss.
We are just slightly over time now, so thank you to our panelists for such a rich discussion. I hope that you found the session informative, and I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of your questions, but this definitely gives us a sense that perhaps we should be running more of these sessions on data and deforestation. And we will follow up with more information on the tools that we've mentioned, including Forest IQ, which is set to launch this autumn in October. You'll shortly see a short survey that will pop up on your screen. So we'd really appreciate your feedback on this session. And yeah, any comments you may have. So thanks very much, everybody. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of London Climate Action Week. Bye.